welcome to my channel. Sit back and enjoy my story. Fred's mother, Rose, was a bright and ambitious 19-year-old in her first year of college when her world changed. Raised by a strict single mother, Margaret, Rose was taught to prioritize education above all else. But one impulsive relationship with an older man, a charming businessman, left her pregnant. Terrified of her mother's reaction, Rose kept her pregnancy a secret for months, hiding her growing belly under oversized clothes. When Margaret finally discovered the truth, she was furious. "You've ruined your future," she scolded. Rose, ashamed and desperate, promised to find a solution that wouldn't derail her life. Margaret insisted Rose continue with her studies until she gave birth, but Rose knew the weight of the child would destroy her aspirations. As the delivery approached, Rose grew desperate. One night, she confided in a kind nurse, Ruth, about her fears. Ruth offered a solution that seemed like salvation: leave the baby at the hospital and disappear. The night after Fred was born, Rose followed through with the plan. With Ruth's help, she slipped out of the hospital, leaving a note with Fred's name. Tears streamed down her face as she walked away, her heart heavy with guilt. Margaret, though disappointed, told Rose this was for the best. Years later, Margaret often thought about the grandson she never knew. While she had supported Rose's decision, guilt lingered in her heart. What if we'd kept him, she sometimes wondered but never voiced. Rose, meanwhile, buried the memories, focusing on her career and pretending the past didn't exist. Unknown to both women, Fred was growing up in the orphanage, carrying the weight of abandonment. Though he didn't know their faces, he often imagined a mother who had loved him and wished for a family to call his own. Back at the orphanage, Fred's life unfolded with equal measures of hardship and hope. Despite the emotional scars, he was a natural problem solver and grew attached to technology early on. Mama Grace, who saw his potential, often said, "You'll do great things, Fred." Her words lit a spark in him. Fred began crafting gadgets from discarded items, imagining they would one day take him far away. Little did he know that the family he yearned for often thought of him, though they were miles apart and worlds away. As Fred grew into adulthood, his brilliance shone brighter. At university, his groundbreaking app, SeedNet, captured the attention of investors. His story of rising from an orphan to a tech innovator made headlines. Yet, behind the cameras, Fred was consumed by mistrust and anger at the world. Meanwhile, Rose happened to see a small article about a rising tech mogul. Though the story didn't mention Fred's upbringing, something about his story unsettled her. A sense of familiarity and dread crept into her heart. But she quickly dismissed it, unwilling to revisit her painful past. Fred's company grew rapidly, but his success hardened him. He demanded perfection from employees and fired anyone who failed to meet his standards. In his personal life, Fred kept relationships at arm's length. At home, his mansion was staffed with workers who feared him. One mistake could cost them their job, and Fred's temper left no room for compassion. People are replaceable, he told himself. But deep down, he knew the bitterness stemmed from his own rejection. Margaret's health began to decline, and in her final months, she confessed a long-held secret to Rose. "I think of him every day," she said softly. "You should find him, Rose. Make it right." But Rose shook her head, unwilling to face the shame of her decision. After Margaret passed away, Rose was left with a box of old letters and photos her mother had kept. Among them was Fred's birth certificate. For the first time in years, Rose allowed herself to think about the child she had left behind. Fred's relentless attitude pushed his domestic staff to their limits. One morning, after an argument with his housekeeper, the entire team decided to quit. They left behind a note, "You have everything but a heart." Fred shrugged it off, thinking he could handle things on his own. Alone in his massive home, Fred started to feel the emptiness he had tried so hard to ignore. That night, as he descended the stairs in frustration, he slipped on a loose rug and fell, injuring his leg. With no one around to help, Fred lay in pain, cursing his situation. Hours later, a deliveryman named Joseph arrived with a package. Hearing Fred's calls for help, Joseph entered the house and found him on the floor. He lifted Fred onto a couch and offered to call for help. "No," Fred snapped, "just get me some water." Joseph, unfazed by Fred's attitude, tended to his injury and stayed by his side. Over time, Joseph began asking questions about Fred's life, gently probing the walls Fred had built. "Why are you so angry?" Joseph asked. For the first time, Fred found himself considering the answer. As the days passed, Joseph returned daily to check on Fred, despite the latter's initial reluctance to accept help. Joseph was different from anyone Fred had met, kind yet firm, unafraid to challenge Fred's worldview. One evening, as Fred complained about people being unreliable, Joseph gently countered, "Maybe it's not people who are the problem. Maybe it's how you see them." Fred scoffed, dismissing the comment, but the words lingered in his mind. Alone in his grand but empty mansion, Fred began reflecting on his relationships, or rather, the lack of them. He wondered if his drive for success had cost him something more valuable. Joseph noticed how Fred struggled to manage the house alone and decided to intervene. He tracked down Fred's former staff, convincing them to return. "He's not as bad as he seems," Joseph told them. "He just needs a little kindness to soften his rough edges." The staff returned reluctantly, agreeing to help on a trial basis. Fred was surprised to see them but chose not to acknowledge their effort. Instead, he retreated to his study, grappling with the shame of needing their help. Though he said little, Fred couldn't ignore the quiet relief of having people around again. Fred's injury forced him to rely on others in ways he had never imagined. The once stoic and self-sufficient man now needed help with even the simplest tasks. This dependence grated on him at first, but slowly, it softened his demeanor. One afternoon, as the housekeeper served him tea, Fred surprised her with a "thank you." The words felt foreign on his tongue, but the smile she gave in return warmed him. For the first time, Fred began to see his staff as individuals rather than tools. During one of their conversations, Joseph asked Fred about his childhood. At first, Fred was defensive, but Joseph's patience coaxed the story out of him. Fred spoke of the orphanage, the absence of family, and his lingering resentment toward his mother. "You've carried that anger for too long," Joseph said. "Maybe it's time to let it go." Fred frowned, unwilling to forgive the mother who abandoned him. But Joseph's words planted a seed of doubt in Fred's heart. Was his anger helping or hurting him? One evening, Fred received an invitation to appear on a national talk show to share his journey from an orphan to a tech mogul. Reluctantly, he agreed, hoping it might boost Sidnet's profile. The interview, however, took an unexpected turn. When the host asked about his childhood, Fred hesitated before opening up about his abandonment. As he spoke, his voice wavered, and for the first time, millions of viewers saw a vulnerable side to the successful entrepreneur. Among those watching was Rose, who froze in shock at the sight of her son. As the interview ended, Rose sat in her living room, clutching a faded photo of Fred's birth certificate. Tears streamed down her face as memories of that fateful night flooded back. She had spent years burying her guilt, but now it resurfaced with unbearable intensity. Encouraged by her younger daughter, Sarah, Rose decided to take a chance. "What if he hates me?" she asked. Sarah replied firmly, "You owe him the truth." Together, they began searching for a way to contact Fred, driven by the hope of reconciliation. Fred's vulnerable interview earned him public admiration, but it left him feeling exposed. He avoided his staff and even Joseph, retreating into work as a way to regain control. Yet, late at night, he found himself thinking about his mother and the unanswered questions she had left behind. He wondered if she had ever regretted her decision. Was she out there, living a life free of the guilt that had consumed him? Fred's heart wrestled with conflicting emotions. Resentment, curiosity, and an unfamiliar longing for closure. One morning, Fred's assistant informed him that a woman claiming to be his mother had called the office. Fred froze, his heart pounding. He dismissed the call as a scam, unwilling to believe it could be real. But as the day wore on, doubt gnawed at him. That evening, he called Joseph for advice. "Should I talk to her?" Fred asked hesitantly. Joseph smiled. You'll never know the truth unless you listen. Encouraged by Joseph's calm wisdom, Fred decided to arrange a meeting, unsure of what he might uncover. When Rose and Sarah arrived at Fred's office, he felt a mix of anger and anticipation. Rose looked older than he'd imagined, her eyes filled with both sorrow and hope. "I'm sorry," she began, her voice trembling. "I've thought of you every day since I left you." Fred listened in silence as Rose explained her decision and the pressures she had faced. Though her words didn't erase his pain, they offered a perspective he had never considered. "I don't know if I can forgive you," Fred admitted, his voice cracking. But for the first time, the possibility of healing felt within reach. Over the next few weeks, Fred and Rose began meeting regularly, slowly piecing together the years they had lost. Sarah, too, became a part of Fred's life, offering him a glimpse of the family he had never known. Fred's anger didn't vanish overnight, but each conversation chipped away at the wall he had built around his heart. He began to see Rose not as the villain of his story but as a flawed human being who had made a terrible mistake. Forgiveness, he realized, was a journey, not just for Rose, but for himself. Fred wrestled with conflicting emotions after his meetings with Rose. While part of him appreciated her effort to reconnect, another part of him struggled to reconcile the mother who abandoned him with the woman sitting before him. Late at night, he'd stare at her old, faded photo, wondering how much of her story he could believe. His half-sister Sarah, however, began to play a significant role in his life. Her warmth and sincerity contrasted sharply with the bitterness Fred carried. She often said, "You've done so much alone, Fred. Maybe it's time to let others in." Fred listened, though he wasn't yet ready to fully open his heart. Sarah's curiosity about Fred's world led her to spend more time with him. She visited his office and marveled at the empire he had built. "You've done amazing things," she said one afternoon, her voice filled with admiration. For the first time in years, Fred felt pride that wasn't tied to his wealth. Their sibling bond deepened quickly. Sarah began attending family dinners at Fred's house, her laughter filling the once quiet rooms. Even the household staff noticed the change. "She's good for him," the head housekeeper remarked. Fred, though hesitant, began to cherish the companionship. Joseph, ever the steady presence, continued visiting Fred regularly. Over tea one evening, he encouraged Fred to share his experiences with others who felt abandoned or lost. "Your story could help people," Joseph said. "It could also help you heal." Fred was skeptical but found himself reflecting on Joseph's words. The idea of transforming his pain into something meaningful resonated with him, though he wasn't sure where to begin. For now, he focused on mending the fragile connections in his life, starting with Rose. During a visit with Rose, Fred learned more about his grandmother, Margaret. Rose described her as strict but fiercely protective, someone who sacrificed her dreams for the family. "She made me who I am," Rose admitted. "Even if I didn't always agree with her." Fred couldn't help but wonder how different his life might have been if Margaret had chosen to raise him herself. He felt a pang of loss for a grandmother he'd never met. "I wish I could have known her," he said softly. Rose nodded, her eyes glistening with unshed tears. One afternoon, as Fred and Rose sat in his garden, Rose finally offered the apology Fred had longed to hear. "I was selfish and scared, and I made a terrible decision," she said, her voice shaking. "But not a day has gone by that I haven't thought of you." Fred didn't respond immediately. He looked at her, searching her face for sincerity. "I'm still angry," he admitted, "but I'm tired of carrying it." Rose reached out, her hand trembling. For the first time, Fred didn't pull away. Rose began visiting Fred's home more frequently, determined to prove her commitment to rebuilding their relationship. She offered small gestures of care, bringing home cooked meals, asking about his work, and even chatting with his staff. Her presence, once a source of pain, started to feel comforting. Fred, however, maintained cautious boundaries. While he appreciated her efforts, he couldn't forget the years of absence. "This doesn't erase what happened," he told her one evening. "I know," she replied softly, "but I'll keep trying." Inspired by Joseph and Sarah, Fred decided to use his platform to support orphans and abandoned children. He began visiting orphanages and speaking to children about resilience and hope. Though the experience was emotionally taxing, it gave him a sense of purpose beyond his business. During one visit, a young boy named Emmanuel asked Fred, "Do you ever wish you had a family?" The question caught Fred off guard. He knelt down and said honestly, "I used to think I didn't need one. But now, I'm starting to think everyone deserves a second chance at family." Rose, emboldened by Fred's growing openness, decided to share more about Fred's father. She explained how she had met him during her first year of college and how his charm had swept her off her feet. But when she told him about the pregnancy, he disappeared, leaving her to face the consequences alone. Fred listened intently, his anger now directed toward a man he'd never met. "He abandoned you, and you abandoned me," Fred said quietly. Rose nodded, tears streaming down her face. "I was wrong," she whispered. "But I want to do better now." Sarah convinced Fred to celebrate his birthday with a family dinner, the first he had ever hosted. Reluctantly, Fred agreed. That evening, his house was filled with laughter and warmth as Rose, Sarah, and a few close friends gathered around the table. As Fred blew out the candles on his cake, he felt a strange but welcome sensation, contentment. Looking around the room, he realized he was no longer alone. For the first time, he allowed himself to imagine a future where forgiveness and family could coexist. Fred's mansion, once a symbol of his isolation, began to feel like a home. He no longer viewed his staff as mere employees but as part of his extended family. He even began hosting weekly dinners, where laughter replaced the silence that had once defined his life. Rose and Sarah remained constant presences, their relationships with Fred growing stronger each day. Though the scars of abandonment hadn't disappeared, they no longer controlled Fred's life. He was learning to trust, to forgive, and to embrace the messy, imperfect beauty of family. Fred's emotional journey continued, but so did his transformation. One afternoon, as Fred was reviewing some company reports, he received an unexpected call from one of his former employees, Henry, who had been fired years earlier. Fred tensed, fearing the worst. But Henry, surprisingly, was calling to apologize for how he had left, saying that Fred had been a tough boss but also a great mentor. This moment struck Fred deeply. He had often justified his harshness in the workplace, but now, hearing Henry's words, he began to understand the impact of his behavior. The conversation ended with Henry thanking Fred for the opportunities he had once been given, and Fred found himself reflecting on his leadership style. Could kindness and success coexist? After his conversation with Henry, Fred realized that he needed to lead with a different mindset. He initiated a meeting with his top executives and shared a new vision for SeedNet, a company where success was measured not only by profits but also by how they treated their employees. "We will be a family here," Fred declared, "and we will treat each other with respect." The shift was met with skepticism from some, but Fred stood firm. He offered his employees more opportunities for growth and insisted on creating an environment where feedback was welcomed, not feared. Slowly, Fred began to see changes in the office atmosphere. There was less tension, more collaboration, and a renewed sense of purpose among his staff. As Fred continued to grow in his personal and professional life, there was still one area that remained difficult: his relationship with Rose. Although they had made progress, Fred often found himself pulling away, unable to fully embrace her as his mother. One evening, as they sat together in his living room, Rose looked at Fred and asked, "Do you still see me as the person who abandoned you?" Fred's chest tightened. He had never confronted this question directly. He looked away, struggling to find the right words. "I don't know," he said finally. "I want to believe you. I want to forgive you." Rose reached for his hand, her eyes filled with understanding. "I will wait for as long as it takes," she whispered. In the weeks that followed, Fred found himself haunted by memories of the orphanage, the loneliness, and the confusion of being left behind. Forgiveness wasn't a simple process. It was messy, painful, and often left him questioning his choices. He spent hours reflecting on his childhood and the anger that had fueled so much of his success. But slowly, Fred began to realize that holding on to his anger was like holding on to a weight that kept him from moving forward. He didn't have to forget the past, but he could choose to let go of its power over him. The more he worked on himself, the more he saw glimpses of the man he could become, someone capable of truly forgiving, not just pretending to. One afternoon, as Fred was leaving his office, he ran into an old acquaintance from his childhood, Mama Grace, the woman who had run the orphanage. Fred had not seen her in over 2 decades, but her presence stirred something deep within him. Mama Grace greeted him warmly, her eyes soft with recognition. "I've been keeping track of you, Fred," she said, her voice filled with pride. "You've done so much." Fred was stunned. "I never thought I would see you again," he admitted. "You were the only one who believed in me back then." Mama Grace smiled gently, her eyes brimming with emotion. "And I will always believe in you." Later that evening, Fred received an unexpected letter, a letter from his biological father, the man who had abandoned both him and Rose. The letter was short, apologetic, and filled with excuses. His father claimed he had been too young and scared to raise a child, but he now regretted the decision. Fred stared at the letter for hours, his emotions a mixture of anger, confusion, and disbelief. Was this just another attempt to manipulate him, or was it an honest plea for forgiveness? The letter forced Fred to confront a new reality. His father, the one person he had vilified for so long, now sought reconciliation. After reading his father's letter several times, Fred decided he needed answers. He called Rose and asked her about his father. She hesitated at first but then explained that Fred's father had been a charming but unreliable man, someone who had vanished when things got difficult. "He wasn't strong enough to be a father," Rose said. Fred struggled with what to do next. Should he meet his father? Should he even consider forgiving him? The choice weighed heavily on him, but ultimately, Fred decided to take the first step. He agreed to meet his father, but only on his terms, setting firm boundaries to protect himself from further disappointment. Fred arranged a meeting with his father at a neutral location, a quiet cafe away from prying eyes. When they sat down, Fred's father appeared older than Fred had imagined, his once confident demeanor now diminished. "I'm sorry," his father said, his voice trembling. "I made the biggest mistake of my life leaving you and your mother." Fred's heart raced. He had spent years hating this man, imagining what he might say if they ever met. But the reality was different. Fred felt nothing but a deep sense of emptiness. "I've lived without you for so long," Fred said slowly. "And now you want to be a part of my life?" His father nodded, desperately pleading for a second chance. The meeting with his father left Fred unsettled. He spent the next few days wrestling with his emotions. For years, he had defined himself by the absence of his father, using that absence as fuel for his success. But now, with his father's apology, Fred didn't know who he was without that anger. Joseph, ever the wise guide, reminded Fred, "You don't need to forgive him for him, Fred. You need to forgive him for you." Fred sat quietly, realizing that Joseph was right. Forgiveness wasn't about excusing his father's actions, it was about freeing himself from the chains of resentment that had held him captive for so long. In the weeks that followed, Fred chose to embrace the uncertainty of forgiveness. He continued to meet his father, but on his own terms. They had no grand reconciliation, but there were small moments of understanding. Fred realized that healing didn't require closure, it only required acceptance. Fred's relationship with Rose continued to improve as well. He no longer saw her solely as the mother who had abandoned him, but as a woman who had made a difficult choice. Though their bond was still fragile, Fred was learning to trust her again. With each passing day, he felt lighter, as if the weight of his past was finally starting to lift. Fred's life took an unexpected turn during a charity gala he hosted for underprivileged children. While mingling with guests, he was introduced to Evelyn, a soft-spoken but confident lawyer who ran a non-profit advocating for abandoned children. Her passion for her work mirrored Fred's recent efforts to support orphans, and they spent hours discussing their shared goals. Evelyn's warmth and honesty captivated Fred. Unlike most people he encountered, she wasn't impressed by his wealth or status. She saw him as a man trying to make amends for his past, and Fred found himself drawn to her sincerity. For the first time in years, he felt a spark of something he had long buried, hope for companionship. Fred hesitated for weeks before asking Evelyn out on a proper date, worried his flaws and emotional baggage might scare her away. To his relief, she accepted. They met at a quaint restaurant, and the evening was filled with laughter and meaningful conversation. Fred felt lighter around Evelyn, as if he didn't have to carry the weight of his past alone. Evelyn, too, opened up about her life, how she was inspired to become a lawyer after witnessing her single mother struggle to provide for her. Her story resonated deeply with Fred, and he admired her resilience. By the end of the night, Fred knew he wanted to see more of her, though he wasn't yet sure if he deserved someone like her. As Fred and Evelyn grew closer, he found himself letting down walls he had spent decades building. Evelyn's patience and understanding encouraged Fred to share part of his story he had never told anyone. "I've always been afraid of letting people in," Fred admitted one evening. "But with you, it feels different." Evelyn reassured him, saying, "We've all been hurt in some way, Fred. But healing is easier when you let someone walk the journey with you." Her words touched something deep within him, and Fred began to believe that love, despite its risks, might be worth pursuing. Though their relationship blossomed, Fred struggled with moments of doubt. His fear of abandonment often resurfaced, leaving him anxious and overthinking. One evening, after Evelyn cancelled a dinner due to work, Fred found himself irrationally convinced she was losing interest in him. When Evelyn sensed his unease, she confronted him gently. "Fred, I'm here because I want to be, not because I have to be," she said. Her reassurance helped Fred realize that his fear stemmed from his past, not from anything Evelyn had done. Slowly, he began learning to trust not only her but also himself. The day Fred introduced Evelyn to his family was a milestone in their relationship. Rose, nervous but excited, prepared a special dinner to welcome Evelyn. Sarah, as always, was the life of the gathering, making Evelyn feel at ease with her humor and warmth. Fred watched as Evelyn seamlessly connected with his family, laughing with Sarah and sharing heartfelt stories with Rose. Seeing them together filled Fred with a sense of joy and belonging he hadn't felt in years. For the first time, he began to envision a future where his fractured family and his budding love could coexist. Fred and Evelyn's relationship deepened as they began collaborating on charity projects. Together, they launched an initiative to provide scholarships for orphans, combining Fred's resources with Evelyn's legal expertise. Their partnership extended beyond work, creating a bond that was both personal and professional. Through these efforts, Fred saw a new side of Evelyn, her unwavering determination and ability to inspire others. Her kindness and grit reminded him of what he admired most about her. She, in turn, saw Fred not as the tech mogul but as a man dedicated to making a difference. One evening, Fred invited Evelyn to his favorite spot, a secluded garden he had renovated as a personal retreat. As they walked among the blooming flowers, Fred's heart pounded with anticipation. He had rehearsed his words 100 times, but as he stood before Evelyn, all he could do was hold her hands and speak from his heart. "Evelyn, you've shown me a life I never thought I deserved. You've brought light into my darkest places. Will you marry me?" he asked, his voice trembling. Tears filled Evelyn's eyes as she nodded, whispering, "Yes." In that quiet garden, surrounded by the beauty of new beginnings, Fred took the first step toward a lifelong commitment. With their engagement announced, Fred and Evelyn began planning a wedding that reflected their shared values. Instead of a grand affair, they chose an intimate ceremony with close family and friends, donating the rest of their wedding budget to their scholarship fund. Their decision garnered admiration, with many calling it a testament to their character. As the preparations unfolded, Fred found himself more excited than nervous. For the first time, he was building something not out of ambition but out of love. Evelyn's calm demeanor balanced Fred's occasional bouts of stress, and together, they navigated the challenges with grace and humor. Fred's mansion, once a symbol of loneliness, was transformed into a haven of love and celebration for the wedding day. Rose and Sarah beamed with pride as they welcomed guests, while Joseph, ever the steady figure in Fred's life, officiated the ceremony. As Evelyn walked down the aisle, Fred felt a rush of emotions, joy, gratitude, and disbelief that he had found someone who loved him for who he was. When they exchanged vows, Fred promised not only to love Evelyn but also to continue growing as a partner and a person. Their union marked the beginning of a new chapter, one filled with hope and possibility. Fred and Evelyn's marriage brought a renewed sense of purpose to Fred's life. Together, they expanded their charitable efforts, creating programs that empower children to dream beyond their circumstances. Their home became a lively hub for family gatherings, community events, and moments of quiet joy. Though Fred's journey had been long and fraught with pain, he finally understood that his past didn't have to define him. With Evelyn by his side, he embraced a future filled with love, forgiveness, and the promise of a brighter tomorrow. For the first time in his life, Fred felt truly at peace. I hope you enjoy my story. Please don't forget to subscribe, like and share to my channel with your friends. See you next.